dragged from her bridal bed and cast out by his family. A cowboy took her in and gave her a true vow. The Bible was still open on the table when I rode past the Alcott place. I didn't think much of it at first. A lamp burning at that hour, 2, maybe 3 in the morning, could have been a sick horse, a calf coming early. I'd ridden that road home from Delaney's spread 100 times, and the Alcott house had never much concerned me. Big house, stone foundation, the kind of house a man builds to show the county what he's worth. Emmett Alcott's house. His son Ryland had just taken a bride that afternoon. I remember the smell of the night, sage and cold, and something underneath it, like hot iron cooling. The sky was that deep blue-black right before it starts to lighten. No stars left, just that color that means morning's thinking about coming. Then I heard her. Not crying exactly, more like a sound a person makes when the crying's already been used up. She was sitting in the irrigation ditch that runs along the front of the Alcott property, 30 yards off the road, and she was just sitting there in a wedding dress. White dress, or it had been. The ditch had maybe 3 inches of water in it that time of year, and she was sitting in it like she hadn't noticed, or noticed and stopped caring, which is worse. I pulled up Cutter and sat there a minute. You learn caution on the frontier. A woman in a ditch at 3 in the morning is not always what it looks like, and the Alcotts were not people you wanted to misread. But then she looked up. I don't know what I expected. Fear, maybe, or the blank look people get when something's broken in them. What she looked at me with was just steadiness, like she'd made peace with whatever came next and was simply waiting to find out what form it took. I got down. Her name was Cecilia. Cecilia Voss that morning, Cecilia Alcott for about 6 hours, and then nothing with a last name at all, which is the condition she was in when I found her. Her face was unmarked. That surprised me, I won't lie to you. When a man puts a woman out in the road in the middle of the night, there's usually a reason you can see. I looked, and there wasn't one. Just the dress with mud up to her waist and her hands folded in her lap and that steadiness in her eyes. She said, I have nowhere to go. Not asking me for anything, just stating it. The way a man names off the facts of a bad situation before deciding what to do next. I said my ranch is 3 miles east. She thought about that for a moment. Then she stood up by herself without offering me her hand or waiting for me to offer mine, and she said, all right. That was the whole of it. My name is Tom Kassler. I was 53 years old that night, which is old enough to know better and old enough not to care about knowing better. I had a 160-acre spread on the eastern edge of the Alcott grazing range, a 3-room house I'd built with my own hands and one hired man's, a barn that leaked on the north end, and a reputation in the county for keeping to myself and paying my debts. No wife. Had been married once, young, and she'd died of fever our second winter. I kept her photograph on the mantel, and I didn't look at it much, but I didn't put it away either. I was not the kind of man who set out to get involved in other people's troubles. I was also not the kind of man who rode past a woman sitting in a ditch. I gave her my bedroll and slept in the barn. In the morning, I made coffee and cornbread and knocked on the door of my own bedroom because it seemed like the thing to do. She came out wearing the same dress with a blanket over her shoulders and her hair down, and she sat at my table and ate without a word until the cornbread was gone. Then she told me. Ryland Alcott had married her for her father's water rights. Her father, Owen Voss, ran a small operation 2 valleys east and had a spring on his land that Emmett Alcott had wanted for 20 years. Owen had agreed to the marriage because he thought it would save his ranch. Cecilia had agreed to the marriage because she loved her father and because Ryland was not obviously a bad man, just a weak one, which she said she thought she could manage. What she hadn't known, what nobody told her until Ryland told her himself on their wedding night, was that the water rights had been signed over 2 weeks before the ceremony. Her father's signature on the deed, witnessed and filed. The marriage wasn't for the water rights at all, or it was, but the rights were already transferred, so the marriage was just ceremony. A thing Emmett Alcott wanted his son to do because it looked right. A transaction that had already closed. Ryland told her this, apparently, with neither cruelty nor particular kindness. Just the way you'd tell someone the weather. Then he fell asleep. She packed one dress in a flour sack and walked out. She didn't say any of this with heat in it. She said it the way I've heard men describe a bad hand of cards. This happened, then this, so that's where we are. I'd learn later that this was just how she was. Cecilia Voss did not perform her suffering. She carried it the way a person carries a water bucket, steadily without sloshing. When she finished, I said, "What do you want to do?" She looked at me straight. I want to work. I want to earn my place until I figure out what comes next. I won't be charity. I said, I need someone who can cook, and I need a fence line walked once a week on the north pasture. Those two things are worth room and board. She nodded. That was the arrangement. I want to tell you about the county, because the county matters to this story. Harlan County was not a place that treated a woman in Cecilia's position kindly. There were good people in it, don't misunderstand me. But it was the kind of place where what people knew about you was built on the first telling, and the first telling of Cecilia's story was Emmett Alcott's. By the time I rode into Carver Town 2 days later for flour and salt and learned what people were saying, the story had already set like concrete. Ryland Alcott's bride had left on their wedding night, gone before morning. That's what people said, and the way they said it, the pause in the middle, told you everything about what they were implying. I bought my flour and salt, and I stood at the counter at Donahue's store, and I said, without raising my voice particularly, that Cecilia Voss was working at my ranch, that she was a decent woman in a hard situation, and that I would take it as an unfriendliness if I heard anything different said about her. Walt Donahue looked at me. He was not a small man, and he had known me for 11 years. He said, "All right, Tom." That was one conversation. There were others. Her father came on the third day. Owen Voss was a thick, tired-looking man in his late 60s, with the hands of someone who'd worked harder than the land had rewarded. He rode up in the mid-afternoon, and I was patching the north fence when I saw him coming, and I put down the wire and walked to the yard. He didn't get off his horse. He sat there looking at my house, and then he looked at me, and I could see in his face that he was a man who had done something he couldn't undo and was living in the middle of that. He said, "She here?" I said she was. He said, "I need her to come home." I said, "That's her choice." He sat there a while. A fly was working at his horse's ear, and the horse kept shaking its head, and Owen didn't seem to notice. He said, "I didn't know when I signed. I didn't know they'd—" He stopped. "I thought it was a good match." I said I understood that. He said, "She's my daughter." I said, "Then go talk to her." He got down. I went back to the fence and let them have their time. I could hear their voices from where I was, not the words, just the sound, her voice low and steady, his with a break in it now and then. They talked for maybe 40 minutes. Then I heard his horse leave. She came to the fence where I was working. She stood there a moment, watching me drive a staple. She said, "He's not a bad man." I said, "I know." She said, "I told him I wasn't ready to come home yet, that I needed time to think about what I was going to do." I nodded and went back to the staple. She said, "Is that all right, that I'm staying?" I said, "The fence still needs walking on the north end." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same county as one. The Alcotts moved sooner than I expected. I'd figured they'd let it alone. Emmett Alcott was a man who understood that attention was its own kind of cost, and a woman working on a ranch 3 miles from his property was not the kind of scandal that required action. I'd figured he'd let the county talk itself out and move on. What I hadn't figured was Ryland. Ryland Alcott was 26 and had lived his whole life inside his father's arrangements, and I think there was something in him, not exactly shame, more like irritation, the irritation of a man who doesn't understand why the thing he did should have any consequences, that wouldn't leave it alone. He started coming to Carver Town more than usual. He started having conversations in the saloon about his wife who had abandoned him. He made sure to use that word, abandoned. I heard about it from 3 different people in the span of a week. I thought about it for 2 days. Then I drove the wagon into town on a Tuesday morning and tied it in front of the saloon and walked in. Ryland was at the far table with 2 of his father's hands. I walked over and I pulled out a chair and I sat down. He looked at me with something between confusion and contempt. He said, "Kassler." I said, "Ryland, I'm going to say this once and I'd like you to listen to it." I kept my voice even. Cecilia Voss is a decent woman who was used in a business deal and had the good sense to know it. She is working on my ranch. She is not a scandal. She is not a shame. She is not your property. I paused. If I hear you're saying otherwise in this county, you and I are going to have a longer conversation, and I don't think you'll enjoy it. The 2 hands were watching me. Ryland's face had gone through 3 or 4 things. He settled on something that was trying to be dignity. He said, "You got no standing to speak for her." I said, I'm not speaking for her, I'm speaking for what's right. I pushed the chair back and stood up. You ought to think about the difference. I left, I don't know what was said after, but the talk in town about Cecilia quieted, and it stayed quiet. 3 weeks in, maybe 4, I came in from the morning's work to find she'd rearranged the kitchen. Not dramatically. She'd moved the coffee tin from the high shelf to the lower one, swapped the skillet hooks, put the onion bin where the flour barrel had been, and moved the flour barrel to the corner. Small things. Things that made sense as it happened. Her logic was sound. Everything was closer to where it got used. But it was my kitchen, and she'd done it without asking. I stood there looking at it. She came in from outside and read my face, and for a moment she went still. Then she said, I can put it back. I thought about it. No, I said, it's fine. And then, because it was true, I said, it's better. She gave me a look, not quite a smile, more like an acknowledgement, like she'd clocked something about me and was storing it away. That was around when I started noticing her in a different way. Not noticing the way a man notices a woman he's looking at. I'd noticed that from the start. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Noticing the way a man notices a person he's starting to know. The particular way she read a situation before she said anything in it. The patience she had with the milk cow who was difficult in the mornings. The way she'd sometimes stop in the middle of a task and just look out at the land. Not daydreaming exactly, more like taking the measure of something. She was not an easy woman to know, but she was a clear one. What she said was what she meant, and what she meant was what she said, and out on the frontier that is rarer than it ought to be. October came, and with it the first real cold. The north fence that she'd been walking turned up cut one morning, 3 posts, clean cuts, not weather damage. I stood there looking at it, and I knew whose work it was without needing to think hard. I rode to the Alcott property. Emmett came out to meet me in the yard. He was a tall man, Emmett Alcott, the kind of tall that had aged into something imposing. 70-odd years old and still carrying himself like he owned every acre from here to the mountains, which he mostly did. I told him about the fence. He said he didn't know anything about it. I looked at him. He was a man who had spent decades telling people things that weren't true with a face that had been trained to be still while he said them. But there was something in the pause before he spoke. I said, Emmett, I have got a woman on my property who was wronged by your family. I am not going to let that stand. You can send your hands out to cut my fence every night until winter, and I will fix it every morning. But I want you to understand something. I held his eye. I am not going anywhere. She is not going anywhere, and I will outlast every move you make. He looked at me for a long time. He said she ought to go back to her father. I said, that's her business. He said, you're making an enemy you don't need, Castler. I said, I've had worse. He didn't say anything after that. I turned my horse and rode home. The fence was not cut again. November, hard frost, then snow, and then a week of cold so flat and gray it sat on everything like a lid. I was working through it. Cattle don't care about the weather, they just need feeding, and Cecilia was working through it too. She'd taken on the hen house and the milk cow and a portion of the kitchen garden's winterizing without being asked. Just assessed what needed doing and did it, which was more than some hired men I'd had. We'd fallen into a habit of eating supper together and talking afterward. Not about much at first. Weather, the state of the north pasture, whether the roan mare was favoring her left front or if I was imagining it. But talk had its own gravity and it pulled things into it over time. She told me about her mother, who had died when Cecilia was 11. About growing up on her father's ranch, doing the work of 2 when her brothers left for the war and didn't both come back. About a schoolteacher she'd had for 2 years who had made her read until reading was the thing she trusted most in the world. I told her more than I'd told anyone in a long time. About the years after my wife died when I just kept working because working was the only thing that kept the other thing at bay. About a cattle drive I'd ridden when I was young up through the territory. That was the first time I'd understood how large the world was, and that I was not a significant part of it, and how that had been frightening and then somehow freeing. About the particular quality of silence in this place, this valley, that I'd never found anywhere else, and that was why I'd stayed. She listened the way she did everything, complete and without fidgeting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You built something real here." 3 words, built something real. I don't know why they settled in me the way they did. Maybe because I was 53 years old and most of what I'd built had been built alone and I'd stopped expecting anyone to notice it. I said it needed building. She smiled then, a real one, the kind that took its time. That's not the same thing, she said. The bad night came in December. I don't mean bad the way a hard frost is bad, or a lost calf. I mean the kind of night that clarifies things, where what you are gets pressed into shape by what happens and you either hold or you don't. Ryland Alcott came drunk. He came alone, which was either brave or stupid, probably both. I heard the horse in the yard around midnight, and I came out with the rifle and the lamp, and there he was, swaying slightly on his horse, looking at my house with an expression on his face that was sadness and anger all knotted together in the way that the young and the wronged get them knotted. He said, I want to see her. I said, go home, Ryland. He said it again, louder. And then the bedroom light came on, she'd heard, and her face was in the window, and whatever he saw in it seemed to take some of the air out of him. I kept my position. Lamp in the left hand, rifle along my right leg, not pointed at him, just there. He said, she's my wife. I said, she walked out of your house in a wedding dress and sat in a ditch in the middle of the night. That's not a wife, son. That's a person telling you something. He sat there. The horse moved under him, and he adjusted without thinking, good horseman even drunk, and he looked at me like he was trying to decide what I was in this story he'd been telling himself. He said, you think you're better than me. I said, I think you're drunk, and you rode out here at midnight, and that's about as much thinking as I've got available on the subject. He sat with that a while. Then the light in the window went out. Not because she was gone, I could still see her shape in the dark, but because she'd made a choice not to give him the lamp's light anymore. He felt it too, the change in the yard. He sat up a little straighter, and then he turned his horse, and he rode back into the dark without another word. I stood there until the sound of him was gone. Then I went in and put up the rifle and stood in the kitchen. A minute later, she came out of the bedroom and stood in the doorway. She said, that won't be the last time. I said, probably not. She said, are you sure you want to keep doing this? I looked at her. There was something in the question that was about more than Ryland Alcott at midnight. I could hear it. She could hear it, too, from the way she held still waiting for my answer. I said, I'm not doing anything I haven't chosen to do. She looked at me for a long moment in the dark kitchen. Then she nodded once and went back to bed. January, February. The cold and the work and the slow business of two people living in the same 3 rooms with something unnamed between them. I knew what it was. I'd have had to be dead not to know. But there are things a man doesn't say when a woman has been through what she'd been through, when the situation is what it was, when he is 53 and she is not yet 30, and she has a life to build that does not necessarily have him in it. So I didn't say it. What I did instead was work. I fixed the barn's north end. I bought 2 more head with the fall's money and got a good price. I repaired the wagon's left wheel in a way that would last. Small accumulations, the kind that build something without declaring themselves. She noticed, she always noticed. In February, she asked me to teach her to shoot. Not for any specific reason she named, just, she said, that it seemed like a useful thing to know. I taught her with a small rifle, the way I'd have taught anyone, and she was a quick study, the kind who asks one question and then learns the rest by doing. By the end of the week, she was hitting the fence post at 40 yards. I said, you've done this before. She said, my father taught me when I was 12. I just needed reminding. I said, then why? She looked at me. Because you would teach me right, she said. And because I wanted to know how you did it. I held that. She picked up the rifle again and put another round into the post. The thing with Emmett Alcott resolved in March, though resolve is a generous word for it. He came to me this time, alone in the daylight, and he dismounted and tied his horse at the post and took his hat off when he came to the porch, which told me something. He said he'd talked to a lawyer about Cecilia's situation. He said the lawyer had told him that given the circumstances of the transfer of the water rights, given that Owen Voss had not understood what he was signing, that a proper consideration had never been given, that there were irregularities in the witnessing. There was a possibility that the deed could be challenged. He said he'd decided not to contest such a challenge if it was made. I looked at him. He was a hard old man, and he was not doing this out of goodness. He was doing it because it was the cleaner outcome, because whatever had happened with his son, and Cecilia had become a kind of stone in the county's shoe, and he was tired of the limp. I understood this. I didn't need him to be doing it for the right reasons to accept it. I said, "That's between you and Owen Voss." He said, "I thought she'd want to know." I said, "I'll tell her." He put his hat back on and left. I told her at supper. She sat very still while I talked. When I finished, there was a long quiet. She said, "He did that because it was convenient." I said, "Yes." She said, "It doesn't change what was done." I said, "No, but it changes what your father can do." She thought about that for a while, then she said, "I should go see him." She meant her father. "Will you drive me?" I said I would. Owen Voss's place was 2 valleys east, a half-day's drive. We left in the early morning. She sat beside me on the wagon bench without talking much for the first hour, watching the land go by, and then she started talking about the country, what she knew of its history, the families who'd come through, the droughts and the floods, with the kind of particular knowledge a person builds when they love a place. I added what I knew. The time went quickly. Her father came out when we pulled up. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, which had been 4 months previous. He looked at Cecilia for a long time, and then he opened his arms and she walked into them, and I found something to do with the horses. They talked for most of the day. I sat on the porch and drank coffee and watched the sky, and when Owen came out at one point to sit with me, he said, "She tell you how she used to ride out to the North Ridge every morning to watch the sunrise, 6 years old. I'd wake up and she'd be gone." I said, "She knows this country." He nodded. He was quiet for a while, and then he said, "You treating her right." I said, "I'm trying to." He looked at me sideways, the way men look at each other when there's a question underneath a question. He said, "She doesn't need someone to take care of her." I said, "I know that." He said, "But she needs," he stopped. Tried again. "She needs someone who knows what she's worth and acts accordingly." I didn't say anything. He said, "That's all I'm going to say about it." We drove home in the evening, the sun going down behind us the whole way, the sky putting on its show of orange and red, and then that final hard blue. She fell asleep on the bench with her shoulder against mine. I kept the horses at an easy walk so she could sleep. April. The mud season, everything coming loose from the cold, the ranch in its ugliest and most necessary time. Fences to check after the freeze-thaw, cattle moved to the south pasture, the garden turned. I was at it from first light. She'd been different since the visit to her father, settled in a way she hadn't been before, like she'd put something down. She worked the same, careful and steady, but there was something lighter in her. She laughed more actual laughs, not just the near laugh sound. She started a kitchen garden from seed in the south window and tended it with the same patience she gave everything. I kept doing what I'd been doing. I did not say what I knew to be true about myself and how I felt. I am not a man who is easy with those words. But one morning in late April, I came in from the north fence, same fence she'd been walking all these months, same line. And I was muddy up to the knee and tired, and she'd made coffee, and there was cornbread on the table, the good kind with the bits of dried apple in it that she'd taken to making, and she turned from the window when I came in. She looked at me the way she sometimes did, that long, clear reading look, and then she said, "Tom." I stopped. She said, "I want to stay." I said, "You've been staying." She shook her head. "That's not what I mean." I stood there with mud on my boots, and I knew what she meant, and I looked at her, and I could feel something in my chest that I hadn't let myself feel in a very long time, maybe 30 years, something that had been packed in ice since my wife had died, and the winters had come and I had just kept working. I said, "I'm 53 years old." She said, "I know how old you are." I said, "I don't say much, as a general rule." She said, "I know that too." I looked at her, at the steadiness of her, at the woman who had sat in a ditch at 3 in the morning with nowhere to go and had stood up by herself and said all right, at the woman who had walked my fence line and rearranged my kitchen and learned to shoot and learned this land and who had stayed through the cold and the mud and Ryland Alcott drunk at midnight without asking me for anything except work and fair treatment and one trip to see her father. I said, "I'd like you to stay." She came across the kitchen and she put her hands on my face, mud and all, and she looked at me, right at me, the way she had in the ditch that first night, completely steady, and she said, "Then I will." I put my hands over hers. My hands were rougher than they'd ever been, and hers were not soft either. Ranch work had seen to that. And we stood there in the kitchen in the mud and the morning, and I thought, this is the clearest thing that has happened to me in 30 years. We married in June. Not at the church in town. We did it at the ranch, with Owen Voss and a circuit preacher and 2 neighbors who'd been decent to her through everything. The preacher was a practical man who kept it short. The day was hot and dry, and the smell of the sage came in through the open door. When the preacher got to the part where I said my vow, I said it looking at her. Not reciting it, saying it. Like I meant each word, because I did mean each word, which is the only kind of vow worth making. She said hers the same way. After, when the neighbors had gone and Owen had taken his wagon east and the preacher had ridden on, we sat on the porch in the last of the light. No particular ceremony about it. She had a cup of coffee. I had mine. The land was going quiet the way it does in the early evening, the cattle settled, the horses at the fence, the sky holding its color for one last hour. She said, "You know what I thought when you stopped on the road that night?" I said I didn't. She said, "I thought that man is going to make a calculation." She looked at me. Whether it was worth the trouble, whether I was worth the trouble. I said, "And?" She said, "You didn't. You just got down off your horse." I didn't say anything. The land sat there doing what it had always done. The sage smell came and went with the breeze. She put her hand on mine on the arm of the chair. Not dramatically, just put it there. I turned my hand over. We sat like that until it was full dark and the stars were out, and the only sound was the land at night, which is no sound at all if you haven't learned to hear it. And everything there was to say between us had been said already, or would be said in time, or didn't need saying. The preacher had written our names in his book. Tom Kassler, Cecilia Kassler. New names take a while to feel like yours. I figured by the end of summer this one would fit. I was already starting to think it would fit before that.